Welcome to this conversation on using the Clean Air Act to address climate change. I'm James Todd with Duke's News Office, and with me is Jonas Monast. He is the Director of Climate and Energy Program at Duke's Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions. And joining us from Duke in Washington is Robert Brenner. He's a Senior Fellow at the Nicholas Institute. And joining us from the Duke School of Law is Jonathan Wiener. He is William R. and Thomas L. Perkins Professor of Law. He's also a Professor of Environmental Policy at Duke's Nicholas School and a Professor of Public Policy at Duke Stanford School. Jonas, start us off. This week on Friday, President Obama has set a deadline for the EPA to come out with proposed rules about new power plants and how much carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases they can emit. How do we get to this point of using the Clean Air Act to address climate change?
Sure. Thanks, James. So the Clean Air Act has always been in the background, right? So in the beginning, in the early 2000s, and building momentum up until 2008, 2009, 2010, there was a debate on Capitol Hill around creating a program specifically aimed at limiting greenhouse gas emissions from a lot of stationary sources, including power plants. And at the centerpiece of that was the cap and trade program that a lot of viewers may have heard of. That didn't lead to final passage of legislation. In the background of that, the Clean Air Act, enacted more than 40 years ago now, is a very flexible statute that creates an obligation that if there is a pollutant that endangers public health and welfare, the EPA has an obligation to regulate that pollutant. In 2007, the Supreme Court issued an opinion that found that the definition of pollutant as written in the Clean Air Act covers carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions, creating an obligation for the EPA to determine whether or not CO2 endangered public health and welfare. The EPA found that it did, and it now has led to a number of steps that have gotten us to this point where we're focusing on CO2 emissions from large power plants.
And Professor Wiener, you have advised various administrations, Bush 41 and the Clinton administration, on environmental policy. Talk about, as Jonas Monast was explaining, using an act, some legislation from more than 40 years ago to address a problem that wasn't even front and center then. Talk about the policy climate here.
Sure. Well, climate change may not have been the top issue on the environmental agenda 40 or 30 years ago, but it's been long understood scientifically that it was a serious issue. Even in the 1960s and 70s, the U.S. government was issuing important reports on concern about climate change, and as early as 1989, President George H.W. Bush, meeting jointly with Mikhail Gorbachev, announced negotiations on a new treaty on climate change. And so it's been, at least since then, a high-level policy issue. There were almost simultaneously there have been hearings in the U.S. Senate led by a senator at the time named Al Gore. And so in the late 1980s, this was really becoming a very prominent policy issue. That led to negotiations on an international treaty called the Framework Convention on Climate Change.
And is that the basis for the Kyoto Protocol, that name? That's
the broader treaty to which the Kyoto Protocol is an addition. And the Framework Convention was agreed at the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, and it was signed and ratified by the United States and many other countries. The United States is a party to that treaty. And then the Kyoto Protocol was agreed in 1997. 5 years later, the U.S. signed that, but never ratified it, not under the Clinton administration, not under the following George W. Bush administration. And so, there, as Jonas Monast said, there's been longstanding debate and efforts in Congress to adopt legislation that would implement a new climate change law for the United States, which in different bills had some progress in the Senate. Then there was a bill that was actually passed by the House of Representatives in 2009, but then a Senate counterpart was not enacted. And so, meanwhile, the Clean Air Act, enacted in 1970, amended in 1977, and 1990, has, as Jonas mentioned, has been there in the background.
And Professor Wiener, is it fair to say that because that legislation has stalled, the Kyoto Protocol is losing momentum, and that's what's brought us to the Clean Air Act, or is that an oversimplification?
Well, the Kyoto Protocol called for emissions limits by 2012. So at least in its first commitment period, the Kyoto Protocol is ending now anyway. There are negotiations on a future treaty, which is supposed to now be negotiated by 2015 to take effect by 2020. But the U.S. legislation is kind of running on a parallel track, which had to do with whether or not the United States ratifies the Kyoto Protocol or something subsequent. What should the United States law on greenhouse gas emissions be?
Let's bring in Rob Brenner at the Duke in Washington office. Rob, you worked at the EPA for more than 30 years, so you've been around for all of this. Some early reports in the Washington Post and New York Times say that these proposed rules this week may be different for gas power plants, new gas power plants versus coal-fired power plants. What are you hearing from your colleagues up there about what might be in these proposed rules?
Well, I don't have any inside information on what's going to be in the rules, but I think from what we saw in the earlier proposal, which came out about a year ago, we probably have a sense of the direction in which the agency is headed. And it raises a long-standing debate within the Clean Air Act.
Rob, can you fill us in on that previous proposal from the EPA? Sort of how is that deficient such that we're coming back around a second time?
So the agency had issued a proposal, and I will not get our listeners lost in numbers and just say that it set an allowable average emission rate for coal and natural gas plant. How many pounds of carbon dioxide emissions could be released from the plant per megawatt hour of electricity produced. And in the initial proposal, the limit was going to be the same for coal and natural gas plants. And we are now hearing rumors, at least, that those numbers will change a bit, that there'll be a different number for coal, probably somewhat higher than the number for gas.
And what would be the rationale for that? If it's the same gases, same effect in the atmosphere, why have a sort of a different rule depending on the type of energy being used?
That's exactly the perspective from past Clean Air Act actions that I wanted to provide, that there's always been a long-standing debate over, with this type of regulation involving power plants, should EPA and the nation view fossil fuel power plants as these are facilities that produce electricity, and therefore the same limit should apply to all plants? Or are there differences, that it's different producing electricity from coal and producing electricity from gas? And if we want to have diversity in our energy supply, maybe we should be sure that the standards that are set reflect what can be achieved cost effectively from coal plants versus natural gas plants in this instance. And so EPA is faced with a tough challenge in developing these standards to figure out how best to take into account both these fuel diversity types of considerations, but also the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from these plants.
James, if I could
Please.
jump in, this is one of the challenges that the EPA is facing with regulating greenhouse gases under a 40-year-old statute, as opposed to a new piece of legislation that was aimed at the challenge of greenhouse gas emissions specifically, which is a globally mixing pollutant as opposed to a local or regional pollutant, which was what the Congress had in mind in 1970 when it passed the Clean Air Act. Now, fortunately, the language that the EPA is operating under right now for the new coal-fired power plants is a very flexible language, right? So you can read it quite broadly. One of the terms is best system of emission reduction. So there are arguments that the EPA could interpret the term system broad enough to allow some flexible compliance mechanisms rather than require every single power plant, either new or existing, to to do something specific. So there are some options for the EPA when developing the rule, but they do still have to fit whatever they're doing right now within the language of the Clean Air Act as it exists today.
And I want to get into, inevitably, I think there's going to be some pushback here. In fact, the New York Times article says that these new rules, as they're sort of being talked about even before they're formally proposed, face a lobbying Donnybrook and an all but certain court challenge. So, Professor Wiener, can you talk to the kind of pushback both in the public comment period but also in the courts? I mean, we've really gotten to this point through litigation that the EPA can do this at all. What sorts of future litigation do you see?
Well, I think the principal initial pushback that you're referring to is from the coal industry or coal-fired power plants, or arguing that even the revised rate that they might be subject to under the new proposed regulation, which we haven't seen yet, but arguing that it's not feasible for them, that it's not adequately demonstrated, to use the language of the statute. So that might be the kind of litigation that ensues. A different kind of legal question is the one that Jonas was just describing, which is from a policy point of view, because greenhouse gases mix globally in the atmosphere, from the point of view of protecting the climate, it doesn't matter where the emissions occur or where the reductions occur. There may be other local concerns, but from the point of view of climate protection, it all mixes. If there are differences in costs for different facilities, natural gas, coal, or just the age of the facility, or other factors that would make the costs vary, then from a policy point of view, it would be attractive to allow flexibility across those facilities, allow some kind of trading system where...
And you're saying that under the current Clean Air Act, there is a way to do something like a cap and trade?
Well, I think so, and many other people who've looked at this problem think so, but there could also be litigation there that is, if EPA, either for new power plants, which is the rule that's supposed to be issued this week, or for existing power plants, which is a rule that President Obama has asked EPA to issue by next June. If EPA allows flexibility, then some other people worry that that might be stretching the language of the statute, and so that's a different litigation issue, depending on how the rule is written.
And now there's an interesting twist here, Jonas Monast, which is you're saying that even though what President Obama has called for this week in the proposal is regulations for new power plants, you're saying that the Clean Air Act is written in such a way that that could actually trigger regulations for existing power plants.
Yeah, it's interesting. What we're seeing is a debate playing out on two levels right now. We're seeing a debate partly that's focused on what the Obama administration does around new power plants. And there are stakeholders, say on the environmental side, that want to make sure that the EPA and the White House signal that they're serious and they want to see a meaningful standard. There are other stakeholders, some on the private sector, who, even though they're not planning to build coal-fired power plants right now, don't want to see the government take that option off the table in the future. And if the standard requires carbon capture and storage, then that could be more expensive, and therefore they think it may not be an option. So that's one layer of the debate. The other layer of the debate, and what I think is more important and frankly more interesting here, is that the way the Clean Air Act is structured, for CO2 in particular, because it's relatively new and is not regulated largely under other sections of the Clean Air Act right now, issuing new source performance standards is going to trigger a section of the Act that requires the EPA to work with the states to develop performance standards for existing power plants. And that's really where the rubber hits the road, because instead of a small number of new power plants that come out every year in the double digits, we're talking about hundreds of existing coal-fired power plants and natural gas-fired power plants, and there are options for cost-effective emission reductions at the plant level are more limited. So that's where this idea of flexible compliance options and allowing trading, or allowing emissions averaging, or allowing energy efficiency to play a role in compliance could get us to a cost-effective reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. But that's part of the question. Is what
James, it's worth putting out there that when President Obama gave a major speech on this issue back in June of this year, he then issued a memorandum of instructions to EPA, and in that memorandum of instructions on power sector greenhouse gas emissions, he not only set deadlines for when the regulation should be proposed and final, but also he said EPA should do its best to use market incentives, to use flexible or cost-saving options. So the questions that Jonas is posing there, they're very live possibilities.
Rob Brenner up in D.C., I want to go to you. Having worked at the EPA for quite some time, I'm sure you've heard the arguments from the other side, from the energy industry. There was a coal power plant representative that said this new regulations would stop any new coal-fired power plants for the foreseeable future. And then there's the message that, hey, this is going to drive up everybody's energy bill. We're all going to be paying more for our electricity. Rob Brenner, what do you say to that? That this may be well-intentioned, but when the rubber hits the road, you're going to be driving up everybody's electric bill.
Well, there's a whole history in the Clean Air Act of standards being set for different source categories for automobiles, for trucks, for power plants, for cement plants, and there's typically exactly the kind of debate you just described over what the costs will be and whether it'll have much of an economic impact or not. And of course, a lot of it depends on how the technologies evolve. In this instance, with respect to coal-fired plants, the question for new plants is, will the technologies that capture the CO2 from power plants and try to store it, will that continue to evolve? There are several demonstrations of the technology underway and how expensive it will be. And to just give you a sense of how the cost could vary dramatically, if it turns out that the only way to deal with the CO2 is perhaps to find ways to store it permanently underground, indications are that that will be fairly expensive, and the power from coal-fired power plants will be somewhat more expensive too, perhaps on the order of an additional 30%. Now, the ratepayer will typically only see a part of that because it'll be averaged in with other plants. But one of the other options being considered is whether that CO2 from those new power plants could be used in many instances for enhanced oil recovery. In other words, it's injected underground and it forces out oil remaining in wells that have been drilled underground, and it creates a profit opportunity. It creates an opportunity to produce revenues because of that additional oil, in which case the cost of a carbon capture and storage project becomes much, much less.
So that's a potential scenario. Is it, Rob Brenner, pretty much a given that the price of electricity is going to be driven up by any of these proposed regulations by the EPA?
No, it's not a given that it will go up. It depends to what extent power plants and the utility industry are able to use efficiency measures to meet the costs, and that the efficiency measures turn out to be highly cost effective. But you know, if you had to guess, you'd guess there will be some increase in costs, but they can be very modest. And I'll just go back to an example of the debate that occurred over acid rain in the 1980s. That was eerily similar to the debate today. Went on for a decade, and the claims were made that the costs of acid rain controls would be huge in terms of rate impacts. People talked about rate impacts on the order of 20%, 25% in many of the areas of the country, $6 billion a year in total costs. And in the end, the costs ended up being considerably less than that, on the order of $1 to $2 billion a year for meeting the requirements of the acid rain control strategy. So ultimately, the costs depend on what emerges from this regulatory process. What EPA is putting out is a proposal, and there will be a lot of comments back on that proposal about ways to meet the standard as cost effectively as possible. So we have a ways to go before we can really project what the costs of these programs will be.
Professor Wiener, you've also cited the example of the acid rain trading program. So talk about a success here. I think you know, it's fair to say that it's nobody misses acid rain, and nobody is that I read in the paper still complaining about the extra whatever it was $1 billion in order to sufficiently address that issue. So what was that? You know, was that a success, and how so?
Well, the costs that you're asking about and the effectiveness of these policies really do depend on how the policy is designed. It's not just a question of whether to adopt regulations or not, but how they're designed. And the acid rain program that Rob Brenner just mentioned was a huge success and really a pioneering or flagship venture in using trading as a flexibility mechanism to implement a very large and ambitious environmental policy. So that was a system adopted in 1990, enacted by Congress with bipartisan support and under the administration of George H.W. Bush, and then implemented during the Clinton administration and implemented by EPA, I would add, very successfully. And that involved issuing a set of allowances to emit SO2, sulfur dioxide, to electric power plants around the country, but then allowing the power plants to trade those allowances while the maximum was tightened gradually over time.
So this is a precedent of cap and trade under the Clean Air Act.
Right. The United States has used cap and trade or similar systems for several different environmental initiatives, including acid rain, the phase down of the content of lead in gasoline, the in part implementation of the phase out of CFCs that deplete the stratospheric ozone layer, and a number of others. So it wasn't a new idea when it was suggested for climate change, for greenhouse gases. In some ways, it's even more suitable for greenhouse gases because the greenhouse gases don't pose local environmental impacts, or at least CO2 and some other major greenhouse gases pose only global impact. So one of the concerns about acid rain was what's called hotspots, that there might be local concentrations from the trading system. It turned out with the acid rain trading program, those hotspots were largely avoided for happy coincidence of the pattern of where emissions reductions were occurring and where the wind blows. For CO2, that's not even really a concern.
I want to pick up, Jonas Monast, you had mentioned about states and some regions of the U.S. already do have some sort of greenhouse gas regulations, and so there's something of a dance here with federal regulation. What's the interplay there? Learning from states, when does federal law take effect? When does it trump state law? How do these things work together?
Mm-hmm. So I mentioned that for existing power plants, the rule that the EPA will propose this coming summer and then will finalize the next summer, there's a role for the EPA and there's a role for state government. So the EPA sets guidance, creates parameters that they indicate to the states what the EPA expects to see in the rules, but then it's really up to the states to decide how to implement the regulations for the existing power plants within the state borders. And again, because the language of the Clean Air Act is flexible, we could see some states already have cap and trade systems limiting greenhouse gas emissions in the northeastern states. There's a system that's already in operation. California has a carbon market that's operating right now.
Who's getting it right of these existing regional state models?
Who's getting it right is a difficult question to answer, right? I mean, you can look at it from one level and where states are engaging on the challenge of dealing with greenhouse gas emissions, and both from encouraging hydrofracking, from encouraging renewable energy, from creating market systems to limit greenhouse gas emissions. We've seen a dramatic decline in greenhouse gas emissions from the power sector in recent years, and projections are that it's going to stay lower than projections were just a few years ago. What's interesting, I think, about the Clean Air Act and this system that we're entering into now, where the EPA has to work with the states to limit greenhouse gas emissions from existing power plants, is it means that states are going to have to engage on the challenge, right? So you have some states that have already done quite a bit. Some have done markets. There are other programs in place. Colorado, for example, has a program in place that is speeding the transition from old coal-fired power to newer natural gas-fired power. It was done not to address greenhouse gas emissions, but is having the practical impact of reducing the greenhouse gas emissions from Colorado. So there are a lot of programs that may be appropriate for different states, and encouraging the states to engage on the challenge and start start down the path of proposing the regulations to the EPA. That, what I hope, leads to more of a national conversation around the challenge of greenhouse gases and how we tackle the problem in a cost-effective way.
Good. So we're coming up on the hour here. I want to get thoughts from you all about what you're going to be looking for when these new proposed rules do come out this week. And I guess if you could slip in there, what's your advice to the EPA on how these should be written? If they're still trying to figure out the last details, what should they get in there? And let's start up in Washington there with Rob Brenner.
Well, I think what's important for a major and somewhat controversial rulemaking like this one is for the agency to do a good job, which I expect it will, of laying out the rationale for the option it's selected, and also describing some of the other options it looked at and why it decided to use the approach that it did, so that we can have a full debate on these issues during the comment period, which will probably last at least a couple months. These are typically 60-day comment periods, sometimes longer. And then we can hear more from people who are working on these technologies for coal and natural gas-fired plants, what technologies they believe are currently available for reducing emissions, how long they think it'll be until they're more widely available and the cost might come down further, any thoughts they may have about ways in which EPA could maybe take more advantage of economic incentives or other market-based approaches that might be available out there. And that's the way you move from a proposal to a very effective and hopefully legally robust final rule.
And Professor Wiener, what about yourself? What should we look for in these proposed rules, and what would you want to see in them?
I'll pick up on the last point Rob Brenner made, which is, to what extent are there economic incentive or flexibility mechanisms in the proposed rule for new power plants, the one coming out this week? I think that'll be quite interesting. For example, could a new power plant be built and purchase offsetting reductions from somewhere else, from another power plant, from an energy efficiency programs, from carbon sequestration project, those kinds of questions. But I think the really the big issue is the rule that you were discussing with Jonas Monast a moment ago, which is for existing power plants, the rule that's supposed to be issued next June, and that starts with state-by-state implementation. And there's where the cost savings from flexibility across sources from some kind of trading system would be especially important. And I want to just add that a related thing I would be looking for is whether EPA tries to nudge or even push the states toward a kind of national program, because the gains from flexibility from a trading system might be even greater if we had more of a national system than a state-by-state system. And there is language in the Clean Air Act in Section 111 that gives EPA at least the sort of option in its back pocket to propose a model rule, which it has done sometimes in the past, that the states could opt into, or even to go to what's called a federal implementation plan, where the EPA in Washington sets a national program. But that would be certainly more ambitious by EPA. So those, I would certainly be waiting to see how EPA handles that kind of question.
Good points. Jonas Monast, what are you looking for in these proposed rules this week?
Well, first off, so I agree with everything that Rob and Jonathan just said. I think for the proposed rule that we're going to see this week, which is focusing on new sources, a clear articulation of why the EPA believes that carbon capture, if they use a rule that is based on carbon capture, why they believe that carbon capture is adequately demonstrated. As Jonathan mentioned earlier, that's part of the language of the Clean Air Act. That's going to be the fight, I think, around the new rule. So
this is whether that technology is
considered adequately
effective.
demonstrated.
Okay.
Yeah, so we know that's probably where the court fight's going to be, and in order to get to this more challenging question, and I think more important rulemaking, which is the existing sources, the EPA has to get the new source regulations right. So I think that's going to be an important aspect of it.
I want to thank each of you for participating in this office hours conversation. Jonas Monast, here with me, is the director of the Climate and Energy Program at Duke's Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions. Jonas, thanks for your insights.
Absolutely, thank you.
Up in Washington, D.C., at the Duke in Washington office, we have Rob Brenner, a senior fellow at the Nicholas Institute. Rob, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
And over at Duke's Law School is Professor Jonathan Wiener, the William R. and Thomas L. Perkins Professor of Law, also a Professor of Environmental Policy at Duke's Nicholas School and a Professor of Public Policy at Duke's Sanford School of Public Policy. Professor Wiener, thanks for your thoughts on this.
Glad to be with you.
I'm James Todd from Duke's News Office, and thanks everybody for watching.